Okay guys, so this week we're going to talk about the muscular system. Last week was integumentary, the skin. Now we're going to the muscles, getting a little deeper inside. My hope is that this is not going to be a huge long podcast. It's only about 22 slides, so it shouldn't be too long. You remember when we talked about different types of tissues that there are 3 different types of muscle tissue. The cardiac muscle, the one found only in the heart. It's short branching fibers. They fit together with those intercalated discs. It looks striped or striated when you look at it under a microscope. And it's involuntary because you really can't control how fast your heart beats. Smooth muscle. This is muscle that's found in the digestive tract, in the blood vessels, in the bladder, mostly the wall of the bladder, in the airways, and in the uterus. It's non-striated, so that's why we call it smooth. It's also involuntary. If you think about it, you can't control how fast the muscles in your digestive system work to move the food through. And then lastly is skeletal muscle, and that's what we're going to talk mostly about. It's attached to bone. It causes movement of the body. It looks striated when you look at it under a microscope. And again, it's voluntary. You can control when your hands, arms, and legs and everything move. Skeletal muscle structure. It's a little confusing. We are actually going to build one of these in the lab this week, so hopefully it'll make a little more sense. It's called a muscle fiber, and it consists of bundles of tiny fibers that run the length of the muscle. Most fibers are about 1 1/5 inches, which is about 3 centimeters long, and about 1/500th of an inch wide. So they're really tiny. You can't really see actual muscle fibers, I don't think. There is a delicate connective tissue that surrounds each muscle fiber called endomysium. That's this right here. So this is your muscle fiber. Muscle fibers are grouped in bundles called fascicles. That's this here, and what we're going to build is actually a model of this whole thing. The fascicles are the groups of the muscle fibers. Surrounding the fascicles is a membrane called the perimysium. It's a little bit stronger than the endomysium, not quite as strong as the epimysium that surrounds the whole muscle itself, the groups of the fascicles. A muscle fiber or a muscle cell is called a sarcolemma, and the cytoplasm of this is called the sarcoplasm. Kind of makes sense. Long protein bundles called myofibrils fill that sarcoplasm. And myofibrils are what store the glycogen and oxygen that your muscles need for energy. The sarcoplasmic reticulum surrounds each myofibril right here. And then transverse tubules or T-tubules extend across the sarcoplasm, and you can see one right here. These allow the electrical impulses to travel deep into the cell. Myofibrils consist of even finer fibers called myofilaments. These are these right here. You have thick filaments and thin filaments. The thick ones are called myosin. The thin ones are called actin. And it's the arrangement of these that give the skeletal muscle its striated appearance. Now, when a muscle contracts, what happens is what we call a sliding filament, the sliding filament model of contraction. The thick and thin filaments are stacked to form the myofibrils, and they're arranged in a type of lattice work to form sarcomeres. That's what this is right here. There's a Z line or a Z disc that serves as an anchor point. Anchor point for the thin filaments. And the section between those discs is the sarcomere. Now they kind of blew this up for you down in here to show you the thick and the thin filaments in between each Z disc. When a muscle starts to contract, the filaments are really kind of overlapping when the muscle's at rest. They're just kind of hanging out, waiting for something to tell them to do something. And so when the muscle starts to contract, when that stimulus comes that says, okay, time to go to work, the myosin heads latch onto the actin myofilaments and form a cross bridge. So the thick ones form onto the thin ones and form a cross bridge. The myosin heads then propel the actin myofilaments forward, so the thick heads propel the thin ones forward towards the center of the sarcomere. And because the actin, or the thin ones, are attached to the Z discs, they pull the Z disc closer, which shortens the sarcomere. So when a muscle contracts, the muscle actually gets shorter. All this requires ATP. Remember from the very first week, ATP is where your body gets its energy from. In a muscle contraction, the connection between a motor neuron and the muscle fiber itself is the neuromuscular junction. Kind of like the synapse between nerve cells that you're going to learn about, that's what this is right here. The synaptic cleft is a narrow space between the end of the motor nerve and the muscle fibers. So this is right in here, the synaptic cleft. So when a muscle contracts, the following things happen. An impulse reaches the end of the motor neuron, comes down this way, and it causes small vesicles to fuse with the cell membrane and release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So you can see these little vesicles here. They fuse with this membrane here and then release the acetylcholine that you need. Acetylcholine quickly diffuses across this synaptic cleft and then stimulates receptors in the sarcolemma. So here's the receptors, and the acetylcholine has latched onto them. This sends an electrical impulse over the sarcolemma and inward toward the T tubules. The impulse in the tubules causes the sacs and the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. So you can see calcium is kind of important to your body's functioning. Calcium binds with a troponin on the actin filament. That's the thin filament. And it exposes the attachment points. So in response, then the myosin heads of the thick filaments grab onto the thin filaments and the muscle contraction occurs. Now remember, this happens in a split second. And the time it's taken me to say this has probably happened several thousand times. When the nerve impulse stops arriving at the neuromuscular junction, then acetylcholine is no longer released. The enzyme acetylcholinesterase breaks down any acetylcholine that's hanging out that didn't get used, and calcium ions are pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. With the calcium out, troponin and tropomyosin again prevent the myosin heads, or the thick filament, from latching onto the thin filament, and then the muscle relaxes. So the strength of a contraction really depends on the length of the fibers before the contraction begins. This is called the length-tension relationship. I'm not really going to expect you to know a whole lot about this, but it's important to understand in an overly contracted fiber, the sarcomeres are shortened, and then even after stimulation, it can't contract very far before the thick filaments bump into the Z-disc and the contraction is weak. Fibers that get overly stretched, only a small portion of that thin filament is accessible for the myosin heads to grab, and then the contraction is weak again. In partially overlapped thick and thin filaments, the Z-discs are far enough apart to allow for movement during contraction. So it kind of is talking about the tiring of muscles. So the contraction of a muscle, a motor unit, is a neuron and all the fibers that it stimulates. The threshold is the minimum voltage that's needed to cause those muscle fibers to contract, and then a twitch is just a little single brief contraction. Not even really a full contraction if you think about what a muscle twitch feels like. And in order for a muscle to really contract, there's a lot of fibers that must contract at the same time. So the muscle also needs to stay contracted for longer than a split second. The force of the contraction is affected by the size of the muscle, the degree of stretch, and the number of muscle fibers that are contracting. Other things that affect a muscle contraction, the frequency of the stimuli. When a muscle contracts several times in a row, the last one is stronger than the first. When impulses reach muscle fibers even faster, the fibers don't have a chance to completely relax before the next impulse arrives. So the force of subsequent contractions with only partial relaxation is called incomplete tetanus. If the impulses arrive so fast the muscles can't relax at all between the stimuli, the twitches merge into one prolonged contraction called complete tetanus. If you think of that, that's when your muscle is just totally stiff. You can't really relax or move it or anything. The strength of the stimulus also affects muscle contraction. A stronger stimulus obviously is going to excite more nerve fibers and then more motor units, which is going to excite more muscle fibers. So you're going to get a stronger contraction. And then the type of contraction. There's isotonic, where the muscle changes length and moves a load, but the tension within the muscle remains the same. In isometric contraction, the tension within a muscle increases, but its length remains the same. You're probably going to need to know the difference between the two of those. And then the energy source for contraction. All muscle contraction requires energy in the form of ATP. Muscles really only store enough ATP for a few seconds of activity. When muscles are at rest, most of their energy they get by metabolizing fatty acids. Oxygen is plentiful, so aerobic respiration is used to break down the fatty acids. Don't confuse aerobic respiration with respiration. It's different. Aerobic respiration is like a chemical reaction happening inside your muscles. When you start to exercise, the supply of oxygen drops. Muscles break down the high energy compound creatine and phosphate. Creatine and phosphate can furnish the muscle with fuel for about 20 seconds of high energy activity or about 1 minute of moderate activity. Doesn't seem like very much. If you keep going past a minute, which, just to walk in from the parking lot is going to take you longer than that. Muscles then switch to anaerobic respiration of glucose. They start breaking down glucose. This can generate energy quickly. It's useful for intense bursts of activity. It produces lactic acid, which leads to muscle fatigue. So it's important to remember that a waste product of anaerobic respiration is lactic acid. After about 10 minutes of more moderate activity, the heart and lungs have had a chance to increase the supply of oxygen to the muscles. So if you think about when you work out, you start to breathe faster, breathe harder, your heart starts to beat faster. It's trying to get oxygen to those muscles so that the muscles can switch back to aerobic respiration, which produces more ATP. Byproducts of aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and water, which, unlike the lactic acid, they're not toxic to the muscle. The lactic acid can be. So each end of most skeletal muscles adhere to a different bone. The contraction of the muscle causes one bone to move when the other remains relatively still. The end of the muscle that attaches to the more stationary bone is the origin, and then the more mobile attachment is the insertion. And the belly of the muscle is the thick midsection of the muscle. Skeletal muscles work in groups to create movement. The main muscle triggering the movement is the prime mover. It kind of makes sense. The muscles that assist are synergists, and the muscles that balance these movements are antagonists. Whenever the prime mover contracts, the antagonist must relax and give the prime mover control. Antagonists oppose the action of the prime mover. So the prime mover for one movement is the antagonist for the opposite movement. I hope that kind of makes sense. So you can see here, this is your biceps in your arm. The belly of the biceps right here. The insertion is down here because when your biceps contract, the lower part of your arm moves, the radius and the ulna. And so the origin of it is up here at the shoulder because that's the part that stays stationary. Major muscles of the body. I know this is what you've been waiting for. Muscles are named several different ways: by size, by shape, by location and number of origins, by the direction of the fibers, and then by the actions that the muscle does. Remember, the body has more than 600 muscles. And don't panic, I'm not going to make you learn the names of all 600 of them. But I am going to tell you in the next few slides which ones I do know. In the head and the neck, there are several muscles of facial expression: the frontalis, the orbicularis oculi. That's the one that closes the eye when you're blinking or squinting, right here. Kind of makes sense because it's above and below the eye itself. The zygomaticus, that's what draws your mouth upward when laughing. The orbicularis oris is around the mouth, if you think of it as like the lips maybe. It closes the mouth and purses the lips like when you're kissing. And the buccinator or buccinator is on the other side of the face. That it's right here really. That assists in smiling and blowing like when playing a musical instrument or whistling. The muscles of chewing, the temporalis and the masseter. The masseter is the one that closes the jaw, the temporalis up here. It kind of works with that. And then the muscles that move the head, the sternocleidomastoid, this one right here, and the trapezius right here, it goes down towards the shoulder. The sternocleidomastoid flexes the head. Sometimes people refer to it as the praying muscle. It's what puts your head forward. When only one muscle contracts, it rotates the head to the opposite side. So you have one on each side, right here and here. When only one of them contracts, that's the way your head turns. Trapezius extends the head like when you look up, and it flexes the head to one side. It also elevates the shoulder. Those are the two really that I want you to know, are the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. Those are also ones you're going to see when we talk about respiratory and accessory muscles that people sometimes use. Muscles of the trunk, these are all important, all three of these. The internal intercostals, right, is showing these ones right here. The external intercostals, those are the muscles of breathing. And then the diaphragm, it says it's pictured here, it really is up like this. So I think this part right here is really what it's saying is the diaphragm. These are the muscles for breathing. External are the outer layer of the intercostals, and internal are the inside layer. You do have two layers of muscles around your ribs that help you to breathe. The abdomen, external oblique right here. Transverse abdominis is an inner layer, the internal oblique, and then the rectus abdominis is this one that goes straight up and down. I want you to know all four of those. The rectus abdominis flexes the lumbar region of the spinal column to cause bending forward at the waist, and it goes from the sternum to the pubic bone. The transverse abdominis compresses the contents of the abdomen. The internal oblique stabilizes the spine, maintains posture, just like the external oblique muscles. It also permits you to rotate at your waist. And then the external oblique stabilizes the spine during heavy lifting. It also maintains posture and aids in forceful expiration. Okay, muscles of the shoulder and the upper arm, the pectoralis major right here. The deltoid right up here, that's the top part of your arm. The serratus anterior, that one I don't really want you to know. The pectoralis major, know where it is. That's another one that people use when they're having trouble breathing. The deltoid, that's a big one you're going to be wanting to find, and you're going to learn more about how to find that when you learn how to give intramuscular injections, because that's one of the muscles that are used for that. Muscles of the neck, shoulder, and back. Here's that trapezius muscle again that goes around to the front. The latissimus dorsi, I think we already mentioned that because that comes around from the front. And then the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres major, those are the rotator cuff. If you've ever known anybody who's had a rotator cuff tear, that one of those three things is what's torn in that. I'm not really going to expect you to know any of those except for possibly the trapezius muscle, and that's only because it comes around from the front. Muscles that move the forearm. The key muscles are all listed here. There's that deltoid again. You are going to need to know that. The rest of them I'm not really going to expect you to know. Just know like the biceps, and it's kind of a group of muscles, the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and the triceps brachii. When people talk about working their biceps, these are the muscles they're talking about. The pronator muscle, that's the one that helps to turn your hand to turn your palms up. The brachioradialis, it attaches to the radius, I think. And that helps the biceps, the brachialis, and the biceps brachii flex the forearm. Muscles in the hands work with the flexors and extensors to help the fingers make delicate movements. Muscles of the thigh, and this is the anterior view, remember the front view. The iliopsoas is the one that actually flexes the thigh, acting in opposition to the gluteus maximus. And the sartorius, that's the longest muscle in the body that aids in flexion of the hip and knee, like when you're sitting. It abducts and laterally rotates the thigh, like when you're sitting cross-legged, if you are able to do that. The vastus lateralis, that's one that I want you to know because that is another site for intramuscular injections. It's not used a lot for IM injections unless you're giving injections to small children. The quadriceps femoris, that's the most powerful muscle in the body. It's the prime mover for knee extension, and it really consists of 4 muscles, hence the name quadriceps. The rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and the vastus intermedius. And they're right here. And the vastus intermedius actually is underneath the rectus femoris, so you can't really see it. But those are the four. If you hear somebody say they tore their quadriceps, they tore one of those four muscles. Muscles of the hip and the thigh, and this is the back view or the posterior view. The gluteus medius, the gluteus maximus, and the gluteus minimus, those are all muscles of the buttocks. And the hamstrings, that's another group of muscles. You hear people say they pulled their hamstrings. That's another group of muscles. It consists of the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. The hamstring muscles extend the thigh at the hip, they flex the knee, and they rotate the leg. Muscles that act on the foot. From the back, the gastrocnemius muscle right here, that's important to know. The soleus muscle is on the sides. It's a deeper muscle. Contraction of these muscles cause plantar flexion of the foot, like when you're walking or you're standing on your tiptoes. The common tendon of the gastrocnemius and soleus is the calcaneal tendon. This one right here is also commonly known as the Achilles tendon. If you've ever known anybody who's torn that tendon, it's extremely painful when that happens. It's the strongest tendon in the body, but it is vulnerable to sudden stress, like when you're sprinting. And a lot of athletes injure that. Again, it's pretty painful when that happens. Last but not least, from the front, the muscles that act on the foot, the tibialis anterior, kind of makes sense, it's near the tibia. The extensor digitorum longus and the soleus, you saw that from the back as well. These muscles pull on the tendons that attach to the bones of the foot. And then the foot contains numerous smaller muscles that act to flex and extend the toes. So there's the muscular system in a nutshell. The muscles that you need to know. When I do post, I do a weekly summary. When I post that, I will put in there the most important muscles for you to know and the function, where they work, what they do, that you're going to need to know for the test. And that's it. Thanks.